in my experience at RUSI for some time, it's never a dull moment in Whitehall. But this is a particularly interesting moment. The air is cleaner than it has been for quite some time in the surrounding streets, which is very good for the health of our staff and a welcome distraction from Brexit, albeit temporary. I was, in my way to work this morning, I was handed a Extinction Rebellion leaflet, which pointed out that there were similar protests taking place, I think, in about a dozen or more cities around the world. And I looked at that list of cities, and what was most striking about that list is they were all democratic countries, many of them NATO member states. And it's important, I think, when we have a discussion about the future of NATO, to remember how important that shared political tradition in our member states has been to NATO's success. It's not a source of weakness, even if it seems messy. It's a source of strength. And I think when the alliance was set up 70 years ago now, I think few would have predicted it would be such a successful alliance, an alliance which has expanded and been more successful in so many ways we're going to discuss today. It's faced many challenges over that period. It's adapted to those challenges. Many calls, and there are people today who think that NATO is losing relevance. We've heard those calls before, but because it's an alliance that debates and discusses and worries, because it's an alliance that has to bring public opinion with it, it survived and prospered. A really remarkable achievement for which there is really no parallel in any part of the world, but something we cannot take for granted in any way, not least today. So the purpose of today's meeting is really as a preparation for the leaders' meeting that's going to take place here in London on the 4th of December, and it's one of a number of events which RUSI is holding in the lead up to that, to prepare our minds and our thinking on that event, including a major engagement event RUSI's doing on the day before the leaders' meeting, which is focused most of all on bringing lots of young people from the UK and across Europe to that event. This particular event, I'm absolutely delighted. We've got three of the most distinguished, if I may say so, ambassadors to NATO, including, of course, our own ambassador, Sarah MacIntosh, but also the ambassadors from the Netherlands and Estonia, Marisa Gerards and Kyllike Sillaste-Elling, who will address you in turn. And then once they've made their addresses, we will then throw the session open to questions and answers.
Thank you, Malcolm, and it's great to see everyone. It's always such a treat to be among defence and security experts at RUSI, so thank you for coming to talk with us today. I guess everyone in this room knows that NATO's first home was London, and that the first headquarters of the alliance were in Belgrave Square, about a mile that way, and where the Ghanaian High Commission is now. And in 50 and a couple of days from now, NATO's leaders are coming back to London, to NATO's first home, to celebrate NATO's 70th anniversary. And I think they'll do three things at that meeting. I think they will celebrate 70 years of the most successful alliance in history. They will take stock of NATO's adaptation to the 21st century threats that we are living with and have been since 2014. And they'll set the future direction of the alliance and help us to make sure that NATO continues to be able to underwrite the defence and security of the billion citizens living in allied countries. And I thought I might say a bit about what I think they'll see in each of those three areas when they come to London on the 4th of December. On the adaptation, Ambassador Sillaste-Elling will talk more about this in a moment, but NATO has adapted really quickly to the security environment since 2014, the harder, darker environment that we have lived through, with the twin challenges of Russia and terrorism. And just to give you a sense of the scale of the adaptation, NATO has deployed 4 new battle groups to the Baltic states and Poland. It's increased air policing across Europe. It has tripled to 40,000 the size of the NATO response force. It's created a new spearhead force able to respond very rapidly to threats to NATO territory. And it's increased the readiness of forces all across the alliance. It's modernised NATO's command structure, creating 2 new headquarters. And it's developed new strategies for air power, maritime posture, counter-hybrid, cyber, and defensive vulnerable allies. And it's written NATO's first new military strategy for 50 years. We've put in place 24/7 missile defence, and at the same time, we have increased NATO's contribution to the global fight against terrorism and joined the global coalition to defeat Daesh. We've built defence capacity in Afghanistan, Jordan and Tunisia. We've increased support to Ukraine and Georgia and increased our presence in the Black Sea region. We've established a new mission in Iraq and a hub for the South at our Joint Force headquarters in Naples. We've agreed new partnerships, including our first partnership in Latin America with Colombia. We've admitted a 29th ally, Montenegro, and signed the accession protocol for a 30th, North Macedonia. And all allies have increased their investment in defence. UK's been really proud to be at the heart of all of that adaptation and to be playing a role at the heart of NATO's operations. We're leading the battle group in NATO's enhanced forward presence in Estonia and contributing to the battle group in Poland. We are providing air policing in several points across Europe. We're providing the ARC, the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps, and ships to NATO's standing naval forces. We host NATO's Maritime Command and NATO's Intelligence Fusion Centre. We're participating in the missions in Iraq, in the Balkans and Afghanistan. Our nuclear forces are assigned to NATO, and we were the first ally to offer our offensive cyber capability to NATO. And we're developing our own new capabilities and investing for defence in the future. Our leaders will see all of that. They'll also see and guide work that is underway to continue to adapt the alliance to the security environment as that environment continues to change. And there's an enormous amount of work underway. I might just point to 4 things that are particularly interesting. First, NATO's core business of staying strong in the face of Russia and terrorism. The relationship we have with Russia is not the one that any ally wants. All allies are open to a different relationship if Russia stops her malign activities and stops challenging and being in violation of the rules-based order. But NATO pursues a dual track of deterrence and defence on one hand and dialogue on the other, and we are a part of that. But Russia has not chosen to stop the activities that have been so challenging to our relationship. She's chosen to continue them. And so this year, our work to stay strong will include adaptation to violations of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty and the end of that treaty, and to new missiles that have been deployed by Russia in Europe. On terrorism, we will continue to evolve NATO's contribution to countering terrorism and to our missions in Iraq and Afghanistan, because allies believe that when our neighbours are more secure, we are more secure. Second, we will continue to adapt our alliance to the changing nature of conflict. And I think of that as being 2 things. It's about high-tech and it's about hybrid. NATO has adapted well to a cyber age and has made a series of important decisions about how to address insecurity in cyberspace. We have increased NATO's and allies' cyber resilience. We have started a NATO and industry cyber partnership. Now allies have decided that cyberspace will be a domain of operations for NATO, that NATO may use allies' nationally owned offensive cyber capabilities. But there is more that we can do to deter cyber attacks, and that work is underway. Also on high technology, we need to take account of and adapt the alliance to 2 new phases of technology that are coming. The first is President Putin's announced new weapons, including hypersonic glide vehicles, nuclear-powered cruise from his State of the Union address last year. And the second is disruptive technologies that will follow very quickly on the heels of those new weapons. Quantum technologies, bioengineering, and so on can adapt, can change the nature of conflict as profoundly as gunpowder and flight did in their days. On hybrid, NATO has already adapted extensively, increasing the resilience of allies and of the organisation, increasing our indicators and warnings, increasing our ability to respond to disinformation and through stronger strategic communications. But there is more that we can do to deter hybrid attacks. Third area, defence investment. All allies are investing more in defence, and between 2016 and 2020, non-US allies will have invested $120 billion more in defence. That's an enormous investment and very welcome. But here too there is further to go, because not all allies yet have a plan to invest 2% in defence. So I imagine that our leaders will talk about that as well. And fourth, work to adapt to a wider changing global landscape, looking further ahead. George Canning, one of our previous foreign secretaries, described the global balance of power as a standard perpetually varying, with new powers rising and the global order changing. That will have implications, and they need to be understood. We're moving from an industrial age to an information age, and that will change both the means of contest and the nature and economics of conflict. And we need to understand the implications for NATO's security. And there are wider global changes: demography, urbanisation, interconnectivity, and environmental change that will also have implications for our security. NATO will not lead the international response to all of those, but in underwriting the security and defence of 1 billion citizens, NATO does need to understand the changes and the risks they might pose to our security, needs to be able to work out the right contribution at the right time and in the right way, and it needs to maintain the partnerships that help it to be part of an international response that supports our security. So on the 4th of December, I would expect our leaders to set direction on these issues that helps to ensure that the alliance stays able to underwrite our security in a changing landscape. And the third thing they will do is they will celebrate NATO's successes, and they'll look back over 70 years of the enormous successes that the alliance has had. They'll note that it has kept us safe from aggression, that it has helped to heal the wounds of Europe's wars, that it provided strength and stability through the Cold War, deterring aggression, keeping the peace, and ultimately helping to lift the Iron Curtain. That NATO has contributed through its open door policy to the expansion of freedom in Europe, that it has kept the peace and supported stability in the Balkans, in Afghanistan, and it's reduced piracy in the Indian Ocean, and that allies working together have saved money by providing collective defence, have adapted their capabilities to stay interoperable and effective, have planned for the future, and have worked together to keep us all safe. NATO's first SACEUR, Dwight Eisenhower, said that NATO was not only concerned with the protection of territory, but also with the defence of a way of life. It was a good aim in 1949, and it's a good aim in 2019, and I'm pretty sure it's one that our leaders will be seeking to continue.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to come and speak at RUSI. And it's a very nice change to sitting in the NATO headquarters in Brussels, and really appreciate the invitation. And I'm really happy to have the opportunity to talk from the perspective of a small ally located in northeast corner of the alliance. Estonia, as you know, is often referred to as being a frontline state or eastern flank state. And I mention all of this because geography matters, and geography matters a lot when it comes to security, and it's something I feel on a daily basis. Estonia, not only are we celebrating NATO 70 this year, but we're also celebrating 15 years of NATO membership, which is important. in its own right, and at least we can see that NATO popularity during all of the 15 years that we've been a member has not in any way decreased in Estonia. It's always been very high, around 80% support for NATO membership. One of the things that we've learned in history and as a member is that alliances take a lot of work. It's difficult business, especially NATO, I think, where decisions are always made by consensus. So it takes a lot of effort, but of course it's well worth it. And so we're very much looking forward to the leaders' meeting and the celebration of NATO 70. But the backdrop against which this meeting is going to be taking place, of course, is unfortunately not that positive. I mean, we're living in quite an unpredictable, more dangerous security environment today than we were 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And all of that has had a huge impact, I think, on NATO's everyday work. And I think it's more important than ever at difficult times to come together and take stock of what has been achieved and where we're going. The way we look at it is that the adaptation that started in 2014 after Russia's occupation of Crimea and incursion into eastern Ukraine, the adaptation has been going, from an Estonian point of view, very much in the right direction. I mean, some of the things have been happening that we were calling for or thinking about when we joined NATO 15 years ago. But unfortunately, of course, we wish that all of this would have happened in better circumstances. The adaptation generally means that, of course, NATO is no longer focused on out-of-area operations, which it was. So even 10 years ago, I think the North Atlantic Council basically was focusing on Afghanistan. That was the issue of the day. I mean, today it's completely other issues. It's very much the focus on collective defense, on deterrence issues, and also on new threats that Sarah very rightly mentioned. So all in all, as I said, we're quite satisfied with the overall direction. A lot has happened, but more needs to be done. Sarah, you mentioned it very much in passing, the EFP, and I just wanted to highlight that, especially since we're here in London, the importance of the enhanced forward presence for us, for a country like Estonia, and the UK's contribution, which is certainly extremely significant and something that I think all allies are contributing to, and especially the UK should be extremely proud of. This decision was made in 2016 at the Warsaw Summit, as you can recall, very rapidly implemented. The EFP is in place, fully manned and functioning as above all what it was meant to be, to deter, and if necessary, then to defend. And I think this is certainly something that should be highlighted, maybe even more than it is, as far as an achievement for NATO. But also there's a lot of other work that needs to be going on the adaptation. There's a lot of work on readiness. So the NATO Readiness Initiative, which was agreed upon in Brussels at the last NATO summit last summer. So that's also a lot of work going on there. Reinforcement. In general, just looking at what it is that needs to be done so that the alliance is ready to deter and defend against all threats from all directions. And this is quite a lot of work, as you can imagine. It's not a return to the Cold War, because very often that's mentioned as we shouldn't be looking back forward, because I think during the Cold War it was a much more probably black and white situation. Now we have new demands, new technologies coming in that are sort of shaping the overall discussion. We want NATO to do more, all of us do. We want NATO to do more across all domains, all directions. But what does that mean? That means we all need to spend more. All of these technologies cost money. And that's why, like it or not, at least from our point of view, burden sharing has become, I think, fairer burden sharing, one of the defining issues in the alliance. And it's very likely, that the leaders' meeting, it will be the key issue. I mean, well, none of us can, of course, predict, and maybe something will come up in the next sort of 50 days or so, but it looks very likely that burden sharing will be the issue that leaders will focus on, for the reasons I said, because of course, in order to do more, you need to also spend more. You can't do more with less or with the existing amount. And I started with geography, and I just wanted to finish off with geography because Sarah mentioned some of the threats, and the two key threats, of course, that we know that NATO's dealing with is terrorism, probably the most immediate threat. But from at least our point of view, and given where we're situated, probably the most serious threat that we see facing the alliance is Russia. And maybe during the Q&A we can go deeper into that, but I just wanted to sort of mention that as also something that is on our minds as we approach the leaders' meeting. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, very happy to be here in London. What a great weather, nice and sunny. You're not living up to your reputation at all. And we're even more looking forward to coming back in December for our special celebration with the leaders' meeting. So thank you for that. It's a very special year, 70 years of NATO. If someone being familiar with NATO would look back 10 years, you wouldn't recognize the organization. And then I'm not only talking about the headquarters, because we moved to our headquarters, but it's an interesting symbol, I think. If you look at the new headquarters, you see how we are adapting. It's important. I think it's pretty amazing that NATO managed to stay relevant for 70 years, because so much changed in the surroundings, and they managed to adapt every time. And I thought, because we were all three going to talk, I thought, let me take the angle of sharing with you the two main reasons I see why NATO managed to remain relevant. And I'm an ambassador since a year, so it's still really fresh coming into the organization. Maybe the first reason is the unity. I mean, we're 29 countries, soon to be 30, 29 democracies, but very different as well. And although there are so many differences, and I'm sure that maybe you have a few questions on that as well, there's also so much that binds us. And we manage also to close ranks on one very important issue, and that's our core task. And that is the issue of protecting each other, the Article 5, one for all for one. And it sends a very clear and a very powerful signal, I think, to any adversary who might consider attacking us. Because they realize it will trigger a response of the whole alliance. And I think it's really remarkable that for 70 years we managed to preserve the peace in our territory. And that's unprecedented. If you look at our history, if you look at the history of Europe, that has never happened before. And I think for me, from a country coming from the Netherlands that was ruled by the Spanish, conquered by the French, invaded by the Germans, and I think we even had a few quarrels as well. The Anglo-Dutch War, all that was kind of undecided. But I think you still have expressions like Dutch courage and Dutch treat as kind of silent witnesses of that little quarrel that we have. But so for 70 years of peace on our continent, that's quite an achievement. And so for the Netherlands, that's very, very important. We absolutely realize that transatlantic cooperation is and remains the cornerstone for our foreign policy, that there's no alternative. That although we see that also the European Union has to step up, and there is a strategic responsibility, we think, for Europe to deliver as well, we think there's no alternative for our transatlantic bonds, and it's indispensable for our security. And so we as the Netherlands, we are very active and very dedicated member of this alliance. So the first reason is unity. Now the second reason, and the last that I wanted to mention here, is the ability to adapt. I think the organization has been outstanding in adapting to the changing world around us. Maybe to go through 4 defining moments in the history of NATO, and I will do it real quick. The first one, of course, was the start of NATO. I mean, for 40 years, NATO was basically doing one thing, and that was deterring the Soviet Union. And I think it was the first Secretary General, Ismay, who said it very strikingly, just keeping Russia out. Let me just take that part. Keeping Russia out. That was important. And that's what we did for 40 years. And we were even able to finish, or I don't know if it was we of us or the circumstances, but the Cold War was finished without even firing one shot. And that's quite remarkable. And so then NATO turned to very different tasks, do different things, project stability beyond the NATO territory, ending ethnic wars in the Balkans, for example, but also helping to spread peace and democracy and stability by enlarging NATO with former members of the Warsaw Pact or parts of the Soviet Union, I should say. Yes, Estonia, very welcome. Happy to have you. So then the third defining moment was, I think, the attacks, 9/11, the attacks on the Twin Towers, 9/11. This was the first and only time that Article 5 was invoked, as you're all aware of. Collective defense, the important collective defense clause. And since that time, I think hundreds of thousands of our soldiers, not only of the NATO members, but also of our partners, have been fighting and have been serving shoulder by shoulder in Afghanistan, and we're still there. So at that moment in time, terrorism became a new focus area, but also non-state actors suddenly came on our radar. How to deal with that? That was also something really new. And again, I think NATO managed to adapt. They changed because the world was changing. And the fourth defining moment and date, I think it was mentioned both by Sarah and by Kyllike, was of course 2014, illegal annexation of Crimea, but I would also like to mention the rise of Daesh, because that was also in that year. And I think these two things also made us step up our efforts in fighting terrorism, but also and projecting stability beyond our borders, but also, as Kyllike was saying, the collective defense and deterrence. I will not give you all the numbers because it was just mentioned, but it was the biggest reinforcement to our collective defense since the Cold War. And finally, let me mention, and was also mentioned by Sarah, NATO is of course adapting to the new threats of our time. And that's, I think, the challenge that we're facing at this moment. Cyber, disinformation, new technologies, no military conflict will be there without a cyber dimension. But also cyber became a weapon in itself. And I think I really have to commend the UK for taking the lead as well in this area. But also new technologies. We spent quite some time in NATO also studying that, knowing more about what's happening. Artificial intelligence, big data, autonomous weapon systems. All these new technologies, they will change the nature of warfare. And therefore NATO is adapting. Therefore they're adapting. And so we have reinforcement in our cyber defense. We're exercising. We have, of course, our Center of Excellence in Estonia. On cyber, and we established cyber as a domain alongside with air, land and sea. I'm sure that you're aware of it, and Article 5 is applicable also on cyber attacks. So yes, well, let me wrap up. The world is changing, so are we. We need very strong multilateral institutions as a driver of stability. And I think within the whole system of the UN and also the EU, I think NATO is one very important pillar for our security and very relevant. So we're all looking forward, and it's good reason, I think, to celebrate at the end of the year. So we're all looking forward to be back in December. Thank you so much.
Very good. Well, thank you very much indeed, Ambassadors. Thank you, all three of you, for such excellent questions, excellent presentations. We now have just under 30 minutes for questions, so please indicate by raising your hand clearly, and I will address you, perhaps take you in some groups. How are we doing? Yes. Perhaps, and wait for the mic to arrive. Yeah, the gentleman here, and then the lady there.
So, you're gonna start
Front.
with the gentleman, yeah?
Yeah, and then the lady in the back. We just have one mic, so you just have to be patient, please.
Hi, my name is Thomas Drake. I finished War Studies at King's College London. I'm currently just writing blogs on international security, and my main area of focus is primarily the Middle East, where obviously we have a lot of NATO states in places like Syria and Iraq. and what's happened in northern Syria in the last 2 days brings up quite a interesting debate for, I think, NATO states particularly, seeing as how also Donald Trump has said how the United States had come together with a threat to the Turkish state and the PKK. Is there any feeling that NATO is starting to fracture in terms of its policy towards the Middle East? And also because of how close Turkey is getting with Russia, do you feel there is anything we can do to bring back the alliance between us and Turkey?
Cracking first question. Could you pass the microphone to the lady at the back?
Thank
you. Well, our panel reflects on your excellent question. Please.
Hi, so it's another Turkey question actually. So Jens Stoltenberg is supposed to be going to Turkey tomorrow.
Did you introduce yourself?
Oh yes, sorry, I'm Laura Macon-Ishwood from British Forces Broadcasting Service. So Jens Stoltenberg's heading to Turkey tomorrow. What do you expect he'll be saying to diplomats there, to the president? And do you think he'll be trying to encourage the action that's being taken by Turkey to be withdrawn or stopped?
Right, and one third one in this round, please, David.
David Abram, former VP RUSI. My question to the panel is concerning Trump particularly, his views on NATO going forward, because we've all happened to have heard what he's had to say, and also the relationship between the European Union and NATO, as well as do you think a lot of mentions being made about expanding and about the Middle East? Do you think that there's room for other countries for NATO to take on board? Thank you.
I think there's more than enough questions there for the panel to answer, even if they all answer quite different questions. I counted quite a number there. Who would like to start? Volunteers? Shall I start on the right-hand side with the host nation, Sarah?
That's good. Do I need to do anything with it?
No, you don't. Just leave it. Just speak.
Thank you. So, two questions on, a question on the Middle East and northern Syria, and will that fracture NATO? So, I think what I would say about that is a couple of things. First, as Marisa said, we are 29 democracies. We have different histories, geographies, cultures, and of course sometimes we have disagreements. But the lesson of history is that NATO is able to unite around its core task of collective defence and cooperative security, and it overcomes differences to do that. And we've done that again and again. And if Jens Stoltenberg were here, he would give you a list of times in the past that would start with Suez and include our disagreement with Iceland over fish, to exemplify us doing that. And he would go on to say, but the lesson of history is that we stand together, and as Marisa said, we protect each other, and the Article 5 collective defence guarantee is a very precious one to all of us, and we work very hard at it. On northern Syria and the events in northern Syria, the Foreign Secretary has been clear that we have serious concerns about the unilateral military action that Turkey has taken, because we fear that it risks destabilising the region and could exacerbate human suffering and undermine progress in the fight against Daesh, which should be our collective priority. Turkey is a valued ally, and she has shown considerable generosity in hosting so many refugees. But we don't support plans for returns until the conditions for them to be safe and voluntary are in place. What I would say is that I think all allies, and in a way this might touch the second question about what the Secretary General is likely to say in Ankara. Of course, that's between him and President Erdogan, and he will speak for himself, but he already has. And what he has said is that Turkey is a valued and valuable ally. And and at the same time has legitimate security concerns as a result of the conflict in Syria, and that he counts on Turkey to comply with international humanitarian law and to limit the incursion to the extent that she can. He has already said that. I think he's tweeting that last night, and I expect that is more or less what he will say in Ankara. But watch the space. He's very good at speaking for himself.
Great. Very good indeed. I think you've left some space for our other panellists, so Marisa, please.
Okay, yes. Yes, maybe one or two words on Syria. It is of course it's also tough for NATO that when these things happen, but it happened before. I mean, we don't always agree, as Sarah said, and there's a long history of that, and we do agree about our core tasks, and you can see also, I mean, also our minister, he came out yesterday and he condemned the unilateral action by Turkey, because we are afraid that it will increase instability and human suffering as well, and we do recognize that Turkey has legitimate security concerns, and that we should discuss and see where we can assist. But we don't think that solving it by military means will get us to the right solution as well. And I think we will also use. It's not necessarily an issue for NATO to discuss, but just the fact that we are in NATO means that, of course, we will also look into it, and as we did already. Maybe the question on EU and NATO. What I find interesting there is that we, in the Netherlands, we are a founding member of both organizations. So it's really about us. It's not them or us. It's everything is us. I mean, but of course it's not one-on-one. So we have EU members who are not a NATO member, and the other way around, NATO members who are not an EU member, and so there's sometimes a bit of tension where you have to make sure that it all works well. But I think there is a lot of merit, a lot of value in making sure that these two organizations work well together, because you can really strengthen each other. There are quite some instruments that the EU has, for example, the sanction instrument, that NATO doesn't have. So sometimes when something is happening, it really works well if you can find each other. And as being member of both organizations, I think that's something that we should do more often and better, and that we're trying also to do more often and better. We do believe that the two organizations shouldn't overlap or do the same work. That should be complementary to one another. On the other hand, there is some responsibility for the EU as well to step up, to also look into the defense sector and make progress there. And of course, the countries who are member of both organizations, they only have one set of armed forces. So we should make sure that it really aligns, and that you're not doing double work, or that you have certain agreements in one organization that doesn't work well for the other one. So those are a few things I'm thinking of. And of course, there's also a long list of 74 issues that we work on closely together. And one which I think maybe to mention is the military mobility, moving troops and forces over the continent. That's something that's so obvious that we should make sure that it's in place also for the collective defense assignment that we have, and that's something that we take up together, NATO and the EU. But also new subjects like cyber or hybrid, I think it's very important to straight away work closely together and don't invent the wheel twice. Maybe let me.
Please.
Maybe. Thank you. Just to add on the EU-NATO cooperation question, that I think Estonia is in a very similar position. We belong to both organizations. The last thing we want is to be in a situation where we have to choose between the EU or NATO. Both are important pillars of our security, and we certainly. So the EU has been, as you know, of course, trying to and been developing European defense cooperation. It's not moving very quickly. It's moving, I think, at a very sort of reasonable pace. And throughout the process, we've been watching and trying to sort of direct things so that we don't end up in a situation where we have any kind of sort of duplication or conflicting projects or decisions. And I think generally, but on the whole, it makes sense that European Union and European countries do more for their security. But of course, it cannot be, without NATO. And that's the fundamental point for us. Maybe just on if I understood the Trump question was there any specific or just how President Trump has affected NATO, or what was
obviously, Trump is sort of, not as positive as he should be on NATO, and how do you think that's going to go down, and how can we overcome that?
Mm-hmm. Well, the way I think clearly, yes, there have been some more critical comments that the U.S. president has made about NATO, but also there have been some positive ones that aren't always, I think, reported fully. So it's not so one-sided is maybe the first point I wanted to make. From our point of view, we very much, whereas we can't ignore, of course, the tweeting and comments, we look mostly to U.S. contributions, actually, and U.S. engagement in Europe, which I can say during President Trump's time has not decreased. And in fact, one could even argue has in a sense increased. U.S. presence, for example, in Poland, the decisions taken to deploy further forces to Poland. They've increased some of their deployments to Norway, for example, et cetera, et cetera. So I think if we look at the actual sort of facts on the ground and what the U.S. is doing, I think then we see a much sort of a very positive picture. U.S. is a very engaged ally. I mean, a key ally, of course. I don't have to even underline that. And at least in NATO on a daily basis, I think we see how engaged they continue to be. Yes, there have been critical comments, mostly about the burden sharing, which I also said in my introduction. We think that it's a legitimate issue to raise. And actually, if you look at what President Trump has been saying, it hasn't differed much from what previous presidents and administrations have said, maybe different choice of words, but the message is the same, that European allies need to step up and start spending more and stick to the Wales commitments, which were made 5 years ago. So I think on the whole, it's not the wrong message to make, and from our point of view, it's the right one. But yes, maybe the sometimes the style is a little bit unexpected or abrupt. Thank you.
Right. Sarah, footnote, please.
Yeah, well, I just want to pick up on the point that Kyllike just made and say that every US president since JFK has believed that European allies needed to contribute more and invest more in their defence. So the message is not different, just the words are different. And but it has been great to see allies responding. If Jens Stoltenberg were here, he would describe a trajectory that in 2014 allies decided to stop the reductions in defence investment. In 2015 they stabilised defence investment, so from decision they actually made it happen in the first year. And in 2016 they started investing more. And between 2016 and 2018 non-US allies had invested $41 billion more. Between 2016 and 2019, 20, it's $120 billion more, and that is an increased amount. And we already know from the forward projections of allies' defence investment plans out to 2024 that number is intending to continue, will continue to rise. At the same time, allies are in a process of submitting their revised annual defence investment plans to NATO at the moment, and they get pulled together towards the end of each year. And in the course of discussions around those plans as they are submitted, 2 allies have already announced additional increases. So there is no doubt that defence investment needs to increase. There is no doubt that defence investment is increasing. There's no doubt that there's further to go. And we agree with that. Not only is it President Trump the only American president to believe it, he's not the only government to believe it, as Kyllike said. We're proud to contribute more than 2%.
I'm anxious that there are a number of people who want to ask questions, so we're going to take another round, and probably some of the same themes will emerge in the questions. We shall see. Tim, please.
Thanks. Tim Dowse, fellow of RUSI, formerly with the Foreign Office. I'm old enough to remember when there was a glossy magazine called NATO's 16 Nations. Now it's NATO's 29 nations, and as we were reminded, it will soon be NATO's 30 nations. I just wondered if the panel feel that this process of enlargement has reached its natural conclusion, or whether it will continue. Have we, at least in terms of membership, have we reached peak NATO?
And there's a gentleman just behind you.
Thanks. I'm Oliver Warren. I work over the road in the Cabinet Office. To pick up on the conversation about burden sharing, it would be interesting to hear the Ambassador's views on whether we're having the right conversation about burden sharing. Obviously, 2% is totemic, but you can argue about whether 2 is the right number, and you can argue about whether an input metric like that is actually what we ought to be measuring.
And Jonathan.
Jonathan Isle from the Institute. I want to turn you to the relations with Russia. Given the fact that the relations are not, how shall I put it, flourishing at the moment, would the ambassador say whether NATO is actually the adequate instrument to conduct relations with Russia in the first place, and whether the NATO-Russia Founding Act is still relevant as far as deployments of troops on all the territory of the member states?
And please, in the front row, Mike.
Mike Maiden, Fellow of the Institute. China hasn't been mentioned at all in the course of your presentations. I'm not sure whether that means that it's not on NATO's radar, or if it is, could you say a few words of how NATO views the growth of China and its efforts to expand its influence?
And Ewan, just behind.
Thank you very much. Ewan Grant, I'm a former law enforcement intelligence analyst who's worked on European Commission programs in the ex-Soviet states and the Baltic states. I have got a copy of Gerald Seymour's cyber warfare book, A Damn Serious Business, which is set in London and Narva, on my Kindle. My question is, in relation to cyber and hybrid, it's very much a Mark Galliotti question. Is enough being done to utilize the financial power of the Western countries, given that the financial system has to have elaborate defenses for obvious reasons against cyber, as a potential reserve force of expertise and closer working against threats from nation-state actors? And following on immediately then from that, from Ambassador Elling, have you had many questions from people about the geopolitics of the Danske Bank case, which is of course affecting the whole of Europe and beyond? That's not a comment against Estonia, and I must stress that. Thank you.
I think you probably all agree with me that we have enough questions for 8 minutes, so apologies to those who I've not been able to call, but if we get through all these questions in the next 6 minutes, I will call you. So who would like to start? Ambassador Elling, would you like to start?
Okay, what to start with? Maybe just very quickly on the enlargement, being an ally that obviously has benefited from the NATO open door policy, clearly, as I said, 15 years of NATO membership. No, we would certainly not want to be setting any kind of a peak, but it's a legitimate question in the sense that how does an alliance that is bigger than it was when it was created, how does it work, and how does it affect the larger number of allies, affect speed and agility, which are of course important for a political military organization. So what I want to say with that is that maybe enlargement will facilitate or at least spark a sort of a discussion on decision-making processes, how NATO does business. But as a political goal and policy, we're very much in favor of continuing to keep the door open to all of the countries who want to and can contribute to the alliance. Maybe I'll leave the 2% because anyway, there's 3 C's and everything, but others can maybe talk about that. On Russia, is NATO the right organization to... Well, NATO has dialogue with Russia. There's a NATO-Russia Council continues to meet, even though, there was a decision in 2014 on no business as usual. The NRC meets, that's a useful channel. I don't want to say if it should be NATO or any other organization, but I think what is important, you mentioned the founding out and the deployments. I mean, I think we are in a different security environment than we were back when the founding act was signed quite clearly. So I don't think that any NATO, well, I don't want to say, but I think nobody's planning to do anything that could be seen as being aggressive or provocative. But at the end of the day, I always say that NATO has to do what it has to do in a way. I mean, if it needs to deploy more troops for defense and deterrence purposes to any part of the alliance, then that's what NATO has to do. And I don't think that we should be, in that sense, bound by any kind of decisions or documents that were taken in a totally different era. But that's very much an Estonian national point of view. I don't want to say that that's an overall NATO point of view, if you see my point. And on the hybrid, just cyber hybrid, finally, do we use financial sector? Interesting, in Estonia, the whole cyber, sort of revolution or the whole discovery of cyber as an issue started in the 90s with our banks, actually. Yeah, we had, so it started from the financial sector, and from the start it was a sort of a PPP project because we were working together, government and banking sector, and it's grown out of that because of the need to have security. If you're going to have online banking, you need very secure cyber, security, and that's been going on. And I haven't been asked about the Danske Bank, but that's because I'm sitting in NATO and I don't have too much contact. But anyway, but it's a relevant question, of course.
Okay, thank you so much, Ambassador Gerards.
Yes, maybe the question on the 2%, because I had the same question before I started my job as an ambassador. I was also wondering, where does it come from? Why 2%? Why not something different? And the first thing maybe to share with you is that it's only one of the 3 C's. We always talk about the 3 C's, the cash, contributions and capabilities. So it's not only cash, but it's also important what and how many of the capabilities you bring to the table, as well as your participation in missions, operations, or your contributions as well. Of course, there's a clear link between the 3. I mean, without cash, it's very difficult to have capabilities or to deliver contributions. But sometimes you can put a lot of cash on the table, and if it's only used to pay the pensions of retired military, then there's no real capabilities or contributions. Maybe to add one other argument, which I thought was also interesting, is that on the basis of the threat assessment every 4 years, there is a planning cycle. And in the planning cycle, there is a division of labor between the different allies. And so for the Netherlands, it's decided that the Netherlands should deliver to the alliance a certain set of capabilities. And if you add it up, it's more or less 2%. And so on the basis of the threat, we decide together what we need in order to counter the threat. And as that is close to the 2%, I thought, well, that makes sense. On the other hand, during the Cold War, we were close to 4%, but then again, we're not in a Cold War anymore, so that's good. And maybe one small answer to China is also a subject that came on the radar of NATO recently. When I started a year ago, it was not being discussed at all. For the first time, it was discussed at the ministerial in April in Washington. And it's seen as a country where there are both opportunities, of course, and also challenges. And then if you look to the challenges, there's also maybe some security issues, but very often it's also about the economic security, which is not so much an issue that NATO can deal with, but it's more an issue maybe that the European Union is also looking at. So for us at NATO, we're very much trying to understand better at this moment in time what is actually happening. We have to be well informed. And we also see China as a country where the NATO would like to build a constructive relationship with. But maybe, Sarah, you want to add something to that?
Thank you so much.
Is
Ambassador MacIntosh, the final word is yours.
Well, thank you. And actually, my friends and colleagues have answered all the questions that were on the table, so, which is great.
Excellent.
Yeah, so it leaves only for me to say that we are excited, delighted and proud that NATO's leaders are choosing to celebrate NATO's 70th anniversary in London. NATO remains and will remain the cornerstone of our defence and security and the most successful alliance in history, and we are looking forward to welcoming them to London on the 4th of December.
And on behalf of RUSI, can I say I am excited and delighted that you joined us here today and took some time out of your very busy schedule to help us understand where NATO is, but also to give us some insights as to where NATO will be going in the leaders' meeting and beyond. It's an institution that's become absolutely central to the security of all our countries, and it's good to hear it's in such good hands with yourselves and all the capable officials and military personnel who work hard every day to make it a success. So if you please join me in thanking our speakers in the normal way.